It's time for my ranking. And if you don't like it,
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
What's up, Flick fans? Welcome back to the channel. Let's talk about Spider-Man. All of them. And this time we are including both of the Venom movies, and thank God, Morbius. It wouldn't be a complete list without Morbius. And I'm talking anything. Ever. But first, because it's a Spider-Man list, we have to talk honorable mentions. Before we get into those honorable mentions, if you guys want to drop a like, a thumbs up down below, that would help out this channel. And if you want to leave a comment, who's your favorite Spider-Man, who's the best? And say, I'm not wrong below it, because you're not, even though you are.
Now it's time for some honorable mentions.
Just kidding, we don't have any. At the bottom, but actually the top, but really the bottom, but kind of the top, it's Morbius, or Morbius, because that's what this is, Sony. Look, I can't fault Sony too much. They brought us some of the best Spider-Man movies ever. Actually, they've brought us all the Spider-Man movies, but with the best comes the worst, and no, Morbius isn't a Spider-Man film, but it's in a Spider-Man universe, and Michael Keaton's in there giving some of the worst line delivery I've ever seen in a post-credit scene.
Has to do with Spider-Man, I think.
Yeah, I think there's some okay moments in this film. Jared Leto is trying. Tyrese Gibson apparently thought this was one of the best movies ever in this interview.
If there's a such thing as giving one person 6 Oscars, man, I'm like, damn, Jared. Like, man, what is going on?
Matt Smith does a cool dance. So I like some of the things that they do with Morbius as a character and giving him this tragic backstory. You know, kind of making him a redeemable character in the movie, but then you're kind of like, well, I guess he's supposed to be a villainous dude, a villainous entity, but then Michael Keaton comes and recruits him to the Sinister Six. What's going on in this movie? What universe is he in? I need clarity on a lot of things. There were some entertaining moments, you know. What happened? I don't remember. What happened in this movie? Let's move on. Then we have the first Venom film. Riz Ahmed plays our villainous character here in Riot, and this is one of the more forgettable antagonists in a Sony Spider-Man-ish movie that we've seen, because I don't remember a lot about him. I just know that he played the foil for what Venom was in this movie, and you know, the film tries to make Tom Hardy as Eddie Brock, as Venom, a good guy?
You what?
Which we've seen variations of Venom in the comics be that, right? And then obviously Spider-Man comes along and there's this hatred for Peter Parker, but you know, we may not even ever get to that in this universe. Right now, Venom is the focus, and there are some really nice moments between Tom Hardy's Eddie Brock and the symbiote itself. I like the back and forth. I think there are certain moments that are absolutely hilarious, and I went into this wanting Venom to be darker. I want it to be like this big R-rated extravaganza, and hopefully, you know, Carnage comes along in the sequel and gets us there. It's not that. It's very PG-13. It plays it very safe, and it's some of the more lifeless direction I've seen in a Sony Marvel movie or an MCU movie in general. There's just not much to the filmmaking here that's all that impressive, and there are definite script issues, story issues, but a lot of people enjoy this because of that back and forth between Venom and the symbiote. And honestly, I can't blame them. That's fun. Those moments work. It's not the worst superhero movie I've ever seen, but for me, what I expect from the character of Venom doesn't fully deliver. But, you know, you cast Tom Hardy as this character, you at least get some brownie points there. Then we have a movie that has kind of moved down this list, just 1 or 2 spots, and that is Venom Let There Be Carnage, a film that I had fun with when I first watched it, but then as time moved on, it just started to feel like a film that I didn't really want to go back to all that much, and that's not me saying it's a tragically bad movie. If you're looking at the Spider-Man list as a whole, I don't think, I mean, especially if you're starring Spider-Man, I don't think any of these movies are bad, especially the ones right above this on the list. But when it comes to Venom Let There Be Carnage, there's not enough to attach yourself to. That is a symbiote pun.
Wow.
And I felt like, yet again, they played it safe. You have Carnage in this movie. Woody Harrelson, while he's spouting out the craziest lines possible, I mean, nonsensical at times, he's entertaining in the role, and the dialogue that he is given, I get it's supposed to be schlocky and silly, but, you know, Carnage is a horrifying figure in the comics. I thought a horror tone for this movie would have been absolutely perfect, but they're still going for that comedy. They're injecting it in there. And I think that makes it more fun at times, but I also think it takes away from the possibilities of what this film could have been. Venom versus Carnage. But again, these movies, they have their fan base, understandably so. I think the casting's good in all phases, but, the story itself, a little forgettable, and then we get into that third act and some really nice moments of tension between the two characters. The battle is really fun. Maybe a bit of a missed opportunity there, but all in all, I don't think it's a bad movie. There's fun to be had with Let There Be Carnage. Where's Spider-Man? I don't know.
I want Spider-Man!
Next up, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which has moved down a spot since the last time I did this list. I think there are some redeeming qualities, some factors that keep this from being a tragic experience. And I've seen a lot of people say The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is one of the worst superhero movies ever, and I guess I was on that train when I first saw it. I mean, the ending broke me, and I have nostalgia for this movie, but I just found it to be a little sloppy. They're doing exactly what Spider-Man 3 did, Tobey Maguire's movie, to where they're injecting villain after villain after villain, subplot after subplot, and it just becomes too much after a while. I thought Dane DeHaan was going to crush it as Harry Osborn, and he's fine in this film. Dane DeHaan's a really good actor, especially with a role like this, but that Green Goblin in general just didn't really do much for me until the end, and the impact of the role and the role that he serves in this movie and what happens to Gwen Stacy, that was great. And that, to me, is like acting 101 with Andrew Garfield, man. The way he handles that scene is incredibly impactful. It's tragic, but it's beautiful. And I think the end of this movie is beautiful. There's some montages in here, there's a montage with a song in there, and I just thought it was so cheesy. And there's some moments in here that are cheesy. The Rhino is cheesy, but The Amazing Spider-Man 2 has some of the best web-swinging scenes we've ever seen. Some of the best action scenes we've ever seen. Spider-Man versus Electro the first time is amazing. The score is amazing. We forget who composes this movie. That's Hans Zimmer. So I'm looking at this film like redeeming quality after redeeming quality. Unfortunately, it's just not the package that some of these other movies are on this list. That being said, I don't hate this one.
I mean, it's all right.
Man, I talked about Spider-Man 3 on TikTok. There's something about that TikTok audience, and maybe y'all feel the same way, but I put a little lower down on the list, and everybody's like, whoa, hey, Spider-Man 3, it's a masterpiece. It should be number one. Somebody said it should be number one over Spider-Man 2, and I'm just like, ooh, no, why? Is it because, kids grew up with this film and have nostalgia for it, and they haven't gone back to it and actually looked at it as a movie? It's more of the memes that have come from the movie and the moments, because there are some great moments in this film. And that's why it's kind of went up a spot or two on this list, because of the moments and, what it does for Peter Parker and that relationship between Harry, questionable from a writing standpoint. The whole amnesia thing, that's still one of the worst. It's so stupid. I guess people on TikTok will find a way to defend that, but what? No. It's just a really cheap cop-out for them to do things that they felt like they couldn't do otherwise, and it all makes sense. Really? And the big CGI battle at the end, what Sandman turns into. I mean, that was just kind of like generic. I don't love what they do with this version of Venom, and I get it because the good is really good. Some personal moments. And, even the silly dancing and when Peter tries, but that's what it would kind of look like for a super nerdy character to feel like he's cool. He'd just be awkward, and that works in a way. So that's not really my issue with the movie. And memes are good, but it's all the other dumb things that happen that drag the movie down. That being said, I have nostalgia for this. I am in the camp of feeling nostalgic towards Spider-Man 3. I was 12 years old when this movie came out, but I have to look at it as a movie. People saying this is better than Homecoming, and especially Tobey's Spider-Man 2, I'm just like,
What? No.
Everything I just said being said, it's still close to The Amazing Spider-Man, and maybe after a couple of rewatches, it's like The Amazing Spider-Man gets so much right for the modern, or at least at that time, modern interpretation of Peter Parker. Instead of being the nerd on a level of what Tobey Maguire was in the first Spider-Man movie, he is a nerd in a different way. He's kind of like a skater dude and, a hipster type character. And I don't see that type of character as a nerd, but that's how one would be perceived in the early 2010s. So I get why they made those changes, and it actually really works for what Andrew Garfield's bringing towards the character. And you have a different dynamic. It's not Mary Jane this time. It's Gwen Stacy and Captain Stacy and all of these really cool things. Now, the Lizard, one of the more, I don't want to say mediocre antagonists. I like some of the things that Curt Connors does in this movie, but I just don't love this villain as much as some of the other villains that we're dealing with on this list of movies. But as an introduction to this version of Peter Parker, the web swinging, being able to swing for the first time, even though I think that's mastered in the sequel, the beginning of that in this movie is really cool. The thwip sounds, it's really cool. And I just think this movie works as a nice introduction. Is it monumental? Is it game-changing? Do I love it? No, I don't love it. But we were introduced to Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker, and he absolutely crushes it in this movie. Emma Stone crushes it in this movie, and the ending is actually really emotional. So I think this is a nice introduction to, a franchise that did not pan out, or did it? Spider-Man Far From Home. I've lowered my enthusiasm on this movie, not as high on it as I once was. I just felt like Jake Gyllenhaal did so much carrying with this film. He carried the load on his shoulders, and that reveal that could have been absolutely dreadful and terrible, and one that reminded me of what they did with the Mandarin in Iron Man 3. I thought this was handled so much better, mostly because that monologue was delivered by Jake Gyllenhaal. And those moments, while really cheesy and silly, they kind of worked. I think one of my issues here as a director, John Watts, not the best director. I actually think John Watts is a good director, but for some reason with these Spider-Man movies, there's just not a lot of style here. Even with Mark Webb and The Amazing Spider-Man, there's more style in those films. Not as good of a script, obviously, but more style with those movies, and that works. This one is less style from a direction standpoint and more CGI. And it feels like there's more CGI at times. But when you get those Mysterio scenes, obviously you're going to have to use CGI for something like that. Oh, he's not a magician. We're using technology instead. That actually works for me. And those moments, those sequences with Spider-Man and Mysterio, those are great. The holograms that he's seeing, those are really impactful. And Peter's going through it in this movie, man. He's reeling from the loss of Tony Stark, and you feel that because he had Tony Stark's presence in the first movie, and Peter's struggling. You got to remember, he's a kid, and he's having to deal with this. I couldn't have dealt with that as a kid. I couldn't have fought Thanos as a kid. I'll admit I wasn't loving it in the first act. I think the humor is a step down with this movie compared to Homecoming, and, all the water monster and the mist monster and all these things that Spider-Man's fighting. I'm like, oh, that's silly. But then you realize we're not getting the actual truth. It's Mysterio who's doing all of this. Oh, okay. And it's a predictable twist if you know the comics, but again, the way that it was handled works really well for me. So all in all, I like Far From Home. I think it's a good movie, but just not as good as the other ones. We go from Far From Home to Homecoming. That's right. We're putting another Tom Holland movie outside of that top three. Now, this is not me saying I've decided on who I like more, Tobey Maguire, Tom Holland. I mean, Tobey's got the nostalgia for me. He's the guy that I grew up with, and his movies, I think, mean a little more to me. That's why I hold No Way Home in such high regard, but we're not talking about that. Homecoming. The humor's great. It feels like a kid in high school. It feels like a nerdy kid with a nerdy friend in high school. And I've heard people say, well, Ned's too annoying. I'm like, yeah, the two nerdy kids in high school. Now, Zendaya's MJ didn't quite work in this film. I think she finds her own in Far From Home. In this movie, this version of the character doesn't work. It's a little too awkward.
Didn't feel that chemistry. Didn't feel the heat between the two in this one.
But the humor's great, and Tony Stark plays this role in Peter's life that people took issue with in this movie, but I actually really liked it. It's a nice change. I didn't want it to be the same thing. I didn't want it to be another Uncle Ben. Oh, it's the same old. No, switch it up. Do something different. And they did. Then we get No Way Home, and we realize Homecoming wasn't the origin. Homecoming was the first movie in a 3-movie origin story of who we know as Peter Parker, and that all culminates in No Way Home. And this film didn't have to accomplish that ridiculously difficult task. And before we move on to the next one, you have to talk Michael Keaton as Vulture. Not the best fight scenes ever. Again, John Watts, not the most exuberant style I've ever seen. Nothing really stands out about the web swinging. Needs a little more style. That being said, it's the impact of Vulture. And that moment he finds out that he's Peter Parker, man, it's Michael Keaton. You get Michael Keaton, he crushes the role. He does again here.
Has to do with Spider-Man, I think.
Spider-Man. Tobey Maguire. This movie, and, I loved it as a kid. It was like my first experience truly with a superhero movie that impacted me. I remember watching it, and running through my house, acting like I was web swinging off the jumping on the walls. I'm sure my mom, she had enough. She's like, Austin, stop. I'm going to throw you over the fence again. Not again, Mom.
What is wrong with you?
But it just meant so much to me. I believed, Tobey Maguire as a kid. And yeah, it's awkward, it's nerdy, it's silly, it's cheesy. This is Sam Raimi 101, right? He brings us a cheesy movie with a cheesy style, and And you know, something as simple as the extras, and this is really the case with Spider-Man 2, the extras looking at the camera and screaming at some of the camera angles, but that is style, man. That's what I'm talking about that I'm missing with John Watts. I am missing that, like, that flair, rather than the studio kind of churning out another movie that doesn't have an identity when it comes to the director. That's not what Spider-Man is. Spider-Man is clearly a Sam Raimi film, and I love that. The script is actually really good, as silly as it is at times, and Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin is monumentally good in this movie. He's one of the best villains we've ever seen in a comic book film, capitalizes on that in No Way Home, and for me, this one's actually darker and grittier than anything we've really seen from Spider-Man because of that final fight sequence with Green Goblin. There's so much I could praise. At the end of the day, I think the movies we're going to talk about are better films, but in terms of impact and how it shaped my childhood, this film may be one or two. Let's move on to the next movie on this list, and that is Nostalgia 101, or at least a film that takes that nostalgia and plays with it and works with it in my brain. And it's like, here's No Way Home. Blech, there's so much that you love. And it's like, how can I not love this? How could I not? Unless you screw it up big time, which they do not, how could I not love it? A great theatrical experience, one that I will never forget. I went with my friends. We were all just blown away when Peter, it's a room full of Peters. That sounded weird. Peter. I knew it was coming. People were trying to say, they're not going to get Toby. It's like, then how did they get Alfred Molina and Willem Dafoe and Thomas Hayden Church, his voice? And then the most random post-credit scene with Venom that makes no sense. I think it was only there to leave the symbiote, but I feel like Spider-Man's going to find a symbiote in a different way, so that was pointless. But that being said, No Way Home, it's the best John Watts has ever done as a director. I'll say that. There are some shots in this film that are actually really, really great. And remember, a lot of this movie was shot during COVID, so they had to work around some things, and that big moment at the end on the Statue of Liberty, yeah, it's a lot of CGI, it's a lot of green screeny, rubbery nonsense at times, but who cares? Who cares? I was having the best time. The dialogue between the two, they knew that all they needed to do with this movie was nail the dialogue, nail the interactions, nail the villains, the villainous presence, but also, and I think people are forgetting about this, I'm looking on Twitter and people are hating on No Way Home, and yeah, it's not as good as the Spider-Verse movies, but that doesn't mean you have to go and you have to smack on the smack. And I knew as soon as this movie came out and I watched it, I'm like, yeah, they're going to turn on this.
They turn on everything.
Have they turned on it? I don't know. But it felt like fans responded really well to this movie. And, you know, Peter Parker, Tom's Peter, actually grew a lot in this film. I mean, he found his own as Peter. He really did. There's some very emotional moments, and he's learning from the other two Peters what it means to be Spider-Man. I think that's awesome, man. I felt the emotion when Aunt May passed away, the fights between he and Green Goblin. Dafoe here may even be better than the original Spider-Man. Dafoe giving one of the greatest villainous performances of all time in this movie. I enjoyed the presence of all the villains. I really love this film. I know it has its flaws. It's very evident flaws. One or two plot holes here and there, but as an experience, I can't knock it. I never thought I would find a Spider-Man movie to dethrone Spider-Man 2. When I first saw No Way Home, immediately I'm like, that's better than Spider-Man 2. But after walking out of the theater, I'm like, nah, Spider-Man 2 is everything Peter Parker is and should be, and what he goes through in this movie, the emotions that he's reeling from, the relationship with Mary Jane, not feeling like he should be Spider-Man anymore, Doc Ock being one of the greatest villains of our lifetime, just amazing in this movie, and Sam Raimi's style, which I mentioned for the first Spider-Man movie. It's there in Spider-Man 3. That feels a little more studio, hands all over that for me. This is the ultimate. I mean, yeah, it gets overboard. I mean, you know, I mentioned it earlier, the moment when Doc Ock's going up the building and the woman's flailing, screaming at the camera. I'm like, okay, that's pointless. But it adds something that's just different from other comic book movies, and it allows it to stand out. And that moment when Doc Ock wakes up for the first time, that's horrifying, man. I'm like, and even when Doc Ock turns into Doc Ock, that sequence is masterfully constructed, man. I think that's just what was so beautiful about filmmaking back in the day. You combined practical with CGI, and it worked extremely well. And the train fight sequence is still maybe an all-time fight sequence for Spider-Man on the big screen. I love Spider-Man 2. I don't really have a bad thing to say about it other than the moments that are overboard cheesy, but I don't even hate those moments. So this movie's freaking awesome. Into the Spider-Verse. It's the best of both worlds. It's the best of all worlds. Not only do we have Peter Parker, but we have Miles Morales and Peter B. Parker and Gwen Stacy and all of these other Spider-Man. There's a Spider-Ham. It's a pig in a Spider-Man costume. This movie's going to be ridiculous. Nope. I saw the first trailer and I said, yeah, that could be cool. The animation is pretty stunning. Lord and Miller, like those guys, Lego Movie, 2122 Jump Street, they haven't really missed so far except for getting fired off of Solo. What are you doing, Disney? But yeah, get these guys to write Secret Wars. Get these guys to write the next 2 Avengers movies, please. Because they just know what they're doing. They're very good writers. And I understand they didn't direct these 2 Spider-Verse movies, but you can feel the impact. It's very nice. This film does everything an animated movie or a live-action superhero movie should do. It hits you in the feels. It captures the emotion that it's supposed to capture. Not only does it deliver one compelling Spider-Man, not even one Peter Parker, multiple Peter Parkers. Chris Pine's Peter Parker in this movie was awesome. I hate the fact that we didn't get to explore him and, doing what they do with these characters and introducing each one with this comic book style. And this is the definition of a comic book come to life. And the score, and it just comes together so beautifully. And no, I don't have the nostalgia for it like I do with Spider-Man 2, but I can watch Into the Spider-Verse and recognize this is like almost perfectly constructed, right? It's smaller scale, even though there are a lot of universes at play, but Kingpin, a more grounded villain. People had an issue with Kingpin when it first came out. I didn't have much of an issue. The third act's, I guess, a little rushed, but no major issues with this film. Genuinely, I don't have a lot of criticisms. But then,
I gotta tell you, it was perfect.
There's a little movie that's in theaters right now. It's called Across the Spider-Verse. Yeah, and I debated so heavily in my brain what to put at number 1. Do I go with the simplicity of Into the Simplicity, listen to me. That wasn't a simple movie. So many people put long hours, years into that film, so calling it simple is a disservice. But Across the Spider-Verse is bigger. Way bigger than Into the Spider-Verse. More animation styles, about 200 more versions of Spider-Man, and a story that is bigger because we're going from place to place and moment to moment. Not only is it a Miles story, but it's a Gwen story. It's a Gwen story, a Miles story, a Peter B. Parker story, a Spider-Man 2099 story, Oscar Isaac giving his best Marvel performance. I don't know. I mean, I thought he was great in Moon Knight, but I vastly prefer Across the Spider-Verse to Moon Knight. So I don't know. But he's amazing in this movie. And then you have the Spot, which, he's silly, he's comedic at first, got some great laughs, reminded me, that back and forth reminded me of something like the Lego Movie and how fast-paced this film is. I don't know if kids are going to love that, to be honest with you, because it may be too fast-paced, but I don't know. I feel like their attention spans are moving a mile a minute. That's how my attention span is. What'd you say? But then he goes from being this like, oh, look, it's the Spot, to, oh my God, it's the Spot. Like, what's it? I am baffled that this looks as good as it looks. I'm baffled that it sounds as good as it sounds. I know people had a sound issue, like the voices were lower than the music in some theaters. That was actually an issue in my first screening. And then it got adjusted all of a sudden. I could tell it got adjusted, so that was fixed. I just didn't really hear Gwen's narration as well at the beginning. That being said, in terms of the movie itself, there are no issues with the visuals, the sound, the characters, the compelling nature of the story. I think the major issue that people are having is it's a definitive part 1, and there's not a big resolution to this film. So if Beyond is as good, or at least slightly below as good as Across the Spider-Verse was, we are looking at one of the greatest trilogies of all time, and I am still like, do I put this above Into the Spider? I guess I do, because it's bigger. I mean, does bigger equal better? No, but this blew me away. I mean, I was stunned, quiet in the theater. My jaw was on the ground. It handles the multiverse better than No Way Home or Multiverse of Madness. This is how you handle a multiverse movie. Everything Everywhere All at Once last year. This movie this year. I think it deserves a Best Picture nomination. Right now, at this point in the year, in June, I think it deserves to be nominated for Best Picture. And it could get it. Okay, that's a long list. This video doesn't matter if you guys don't leave your lists down below. What did I do wrong? Not everyone's going to agree. That's fine. But don't do the thing where you never make a list again.
Don't ever make a list again with the fire emojis.
That'll help analytics. So whatever, man. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it. This is so much fun. I'm gonna go watch Spider-Verse again. That's what I'm gonna do.